Far beyond the milky horizon, way past the stars, the moon, half a mile from imagination, I'll be out there waiting for you. Let me wrap my arms around you one last lonely time. Let me look into those pretty eyes. Let me keep whatever I find. I remember how you worked so hard. Do you remember how you held my hand? Standing strong in the winds of change, like a tired soldier in the promised land. You fought the battles and you fought the wars, got the bruises and you've got the sores. You gave your soup and you gave your bread, gave your heart but you kept your head. Oh, I'm gonna miss your gentle smile. I'm gonna miss that soft embrace, cups of coffee and the good advice, warm heart and the mirror face. But you'll be there in the summer wind, and in all the dreams you've touched. You're gonna be there in the hope you gave. Took so little, you gave so much. Oh, let me wrap my arms around you one last lonely time. Let me look into those pretty eyes. I'll always keep whatever I find. You'll be there in each breath I take, in every tree, every beautiful lake, in Irish wool and in shiny silk, walks around the block, midnight milk. You'll be there in the strength you showed, the smiles you made on every road. I could give you 11 good reasons why you should stay around. I could give you 1,000,000 more. Those are just the ones I found. So when it's time to say goodbye, please forgive me when I start to cry. And when it's time to go to sleep, please forgive me when I start to weep. But you're everything that I want to be. You are you and you are me. So let me wrap these arms around you one last lonely time. Let me look into those beautiful eyes. I'll always keep whatever I find.
I guess a cemetery can be considered a pretty strange place. If you want to believe that a cemetery is a place filled with scary spirits and the ghosts of people long gone, well, then I guess that is just what you will believe. But if you choose to, you can believe that a cemetery is a library of history, a place where there are countless stories of lives lived to the fullest, stories of great courage and conviction, of great risk and great reward. Of course, there are sad stories too, oh, lots of them, and stories of lives that ended much too soon. And you know very well that row after row, stone after stone, the grounds here have been blessed with the tears of long-gone loved ones, people not at all unlike you and I. It's the stories that bring a cemetery to life, and what we'd like to do is to show you just a few of those stories.
Being the son of a Hungarian brewer, it was natural I would follow my father into the business. That's how I learned the craft. I came to the United States and settled in Milwaukee when I was in my 20s. I became a foreman at a local brewery, and by 1851 I had saved enough money to buy the business. We grew so large that our buildings eventually covered 4 city blocks. In 1874 we produced Milwaukee's first bottled beer, and the product became tremendously popular. I died shortly before the turn of the century, and my son Albert succeeded me as president of the brewery.
My name is Alice Krebs, and I'm the great-granddaughter of Valentine Blatz, and we're here today to look at the mausoleum, and Jerry from Forest Home is going to open the door. Notice the thickness of those doors. My gosh. This is all granite. It's over 100 years old. And this is the very large tomb in the center. Almost looks Napoleonic. Louise and Val, as I say, that's my great-grandparents. Val was born in 1825 in Miltenberg, Germany. And then he died in 1894, and Louise had this mausoleum built in his memory. It's interesting that both brewery families, if you know the name Blatz from Blatz Brewery, both families, the Schlitz Brewery and the Blatz, came from Miltenberg, had the right conditions, the sand, the river, and everything that they needed to make the good water for the beer. And they felt they found that in Milwaukee as well. The other large drawers, of course, they were at the time that they did these, it was designed to be for coffins and bodies. But now with cremation, there is a lot of room in here for all of the relatives. And some of the drawers are not filled, quite a few are. My mother, Ernestine Blatz, Albert Blatz was the son of Valentine, and he continued the brewery. His daughter Ernestine was my mother, and she passed away in 1942. I have a feeling when I come into the mausoleum, certainly like Thornton Wilder's Our Town, that maybe there are little whispers in here, and somebody is, I can see Edna saying to Ernie, well, Alice is back again. It's, it just has an awful lot of history and a lot of family. But I think it's a comfortable place. It doesn't seem really cold to me.
Do you get sad when you're in here at all?
Not at all. No, I don't. I think I'm in awe of it. It's such an incredible a story, and I understand it is one of the largest mausoleums in the country. So it's, and fortunately now the family has provided for perpetuity. So in '92 we had to do tremendous tuck pointing. This whole ceiling was leaking, and there was ivy growing around. So we, the family got together, and we put in enough to have it be perpetuity. So Forest Home will be taking care of it forever.
Are there still a lot of
Blatz family descendants around?
Well, there are about 30, and then they have family, you know. So yes, we have quite a reunion when we get together.
Is there a place in here for Alice?
Yes, right here. Yes, and my whole family. My whole family can be in here, as I say, because of cremation. So I have a drawer, and I don't feel sad about it.
Forest Home Cemetery was first started, and our first burial was in 1850, August of 1850, Orville Caldwell. The original tract of land was 72 acres. Today we are in excess of 200 acres, and we're a traditional cemetery having all types of burials, from raised markers to flush markers, mausoleum, cremation. Milwaukee was new at that point in time, and the outskirts were way out here in terms of Forest Home Cemetery. The people took a day's ride to come out to Forest Home Cemetery and spend a day in parks and so forth settings, and those park settings were Forest Home Cemetery. Forest Home Cemetery has approximately 130,000 people buried at Forest Home presently. I would suspect that we could withstand at least that many more people at Forest Home Cemetery. Reason being is with mausoleum spaces, of which we have in excess of 5,000 spaces, there are space for cremated remains for people that have been cremated. Columbarium niches is becoming more and more popular, and cremation is becoming more popular. We're going to be here for another 150 years in terms of the outlook, in terms of Forest Home Cemetery.
I was born in Milwaukee in 1871, one of 3 sons of a Scottish immigrant. I was mechanically inclined, and I began working in the railroad shops where my brother Walter was a machinist. My brother Arthur worked as a pattern maker. In 1903, along with our friend Bill Harley, working in a shed at the rear of our house on 38th and Highland, we developed what I guess was really just a bicycle with an engine. The carburetor was made from a tomato can. We made 3 of these motorcycles in that first year. The company just took off. I died in 1937.
I was an apprentice Wurstmacher in Frankfurt, and that is where I learned how to make sausage. I brought my old world recipes with me to Milwaukee when I moved here in 1881 and found employment in a small butcher shop on 3rd Street. Within a year, I had purchased the owner's interest and married their niece. I began to manufacture my now famous brand of sausages, making many of my deliveries on foot. I died in 1930, and it is a pleasure to see that my great-grandchildren still manage the company.
This monument is very faded and worn because it's made of limestone and not granite. And George Walker was one of the 3 original settlers here in Milwaukee, along with Solomon Juneau, French fur trader, and Byron Kilburn, the surveyor. And George was born in Lynchburg, Virginia, 1811, and he came to Illinois with his parents when he was 14 years old. And 4 years later, he became a trader, and he came up here and bought the land that we now know as Walker's Point, one of the 3 original settlements here in Milwaukee.
If you think the spot where you are buried is your final resting place, maybe you should think again. In this cast iron casket is the body of Byron Kilburn, one of the founders of Milwaukee, who died in 1870. He was buried where he lived at the time in Florida. But recently, the coffin was dug up and brought back here to Milwaukee, where he was buried at Forest Home Cemetery. If you look in the top of the casket, this cast iron piece slides over, and underneath the glass, which is all cloudy, is the body of Byron Kilburn.
History buff and volunteer Frank Matusik drove the body back from Florida in a rented van.
I went down to bring the body back because the man is an integral part of the founding of the city of Milwaukee. And since his wife and 2 of his children are buried up here, and there's no one else on the plot down in Jacksonville. He really belongs back in Milwaukee. And Jacksonville was very amenable to letting him go as long as he was not an integral part of the city of Jacksonville, which he wasn't because he lived there only 2 years, but bought himself a 450-acre estate right downtown in Jacksonville and started to grow orange trees. The man was a promoter. He could see an investment 200, 500, 1,000 miles away. He was constantly in land speculation and real estate development. And that's why he was very interested in the west side of Milwaukee.
I'm Henrietta Kilbourne, second wife of Byron Kilbourne. Byron was one of the 3 founders of Milwaukee. He was born in Connecticut in 1801. When he was 2 years old, his family moved to Ohio. He was well educated in mathematics, law, music, and history. In 1834, the governor of Michigan asked him to go to the west side of Lake Michigan and survey some of the land there. However, before that, he had been married to a young lady by the name of Mary Coles in 1827, and they had 2 daughters, Gloriana and Lucy. It wasn't until 1836 that Mary came with the girls to Milwaukee. By then, Byron had already bought some land here, along with Solomon Juneau and George Walker at the Great Land Sale up in Green Bay in 1835. In 1837, Mary was a little homesick, and so she went home to visit her father. On the way home, she passed away. So Byron was left with 2 little girls to raise. And in 1838, 1 year later, he married me. I was the daughter of a wealthy, well-established attorney in Maryland. And I came here, we continued to raise the children. We also had 2 boys, Brian Hector and little John. By 1845, Gloriana had developed a bad cough, which somehow or other could not be cured. And it turned out that she had consumption, and she passed away at the tender age of 16. Very well-liked and a beautiful young lady. And that same year, 6 months later, Lucy died. Lucy was about 1.5 years younger. He was the first man to build a plank sidewalk on what was then West Water Street and is now Plankinton Avenue. He built other plank sidewalks in the city. He graded the streets, filled in the swampland, which was on the east side of the Milwaukee River. He developed a sewer system so Milwaukee had clean water to drink. He started the public school system. He published the first newspaper, the Milwaukee Advertiser. And he built the first steamboat called the Badger. And that would bring people coming from the east to Lake Michigan, and he would meet them there with his steamboat and bring them up the Milwaukee River to his side of the river.
Frederick Vogel Sr. lies here. He died in 1892. He and Guido Pfister started a leather company after they both had come here from Germany. And between 1880 and 1920, the Pfister and Vogel Tannery was the largest tannery in the United States.
I joined my father's Pfister and Vogel Leather Company, and I eventually became president. I made a fortune through my various business interests, and in 1892 I financed construction of an elegant hotel downtown. It bears my name. I died in Milwaukee in 1927.
My father, my brothers, and I ran the C.J. Smith & Sons Company, which made bicycle parts and hardware for baby carriages. When the bicycle craze hit the United States in the 1890s, business took off. I became involved in the manufacture of early automobiles by designing tubular and pressed steel frames. After Henry Ford placed an order for 10,000 of my frames, my new company grew rapidly into the nation's largest producer of steel auto frames. I died in 1913.
My name is Raymond Dykus, and I am 75, and I live here about 35 years, 36, and living across from a cemetery doesn't bother me. Those are the quietest neighbors I have. Now that they're gone, they're in a peaceful place instead of heavy traffic like here. There's a lot of history there, a lot of sadness in there. We sometimes walk in there, and it's pretty sad at times what you read on the stones.
Now when people say, oh, it must be spooky living next to a cemetery, what do you say?
I don't know what would be spooky. Those people don't come out at night. How would it be spooky? They wouldn't come out if they could.
Alfred Lunt and Lynn Fontanne were universally regarded as the greatest acting team in the history of the English-speaking theater. They were married for 55 years and were inseparable both on and off the stage. They lived in the small town of Genesee Depot, not far from Milwaukee.
We never planned working together, you know. It all came as a great surprise to us.
But once you were started, wasn't it true that there were plays that were written specifically for you?
Yes, once we got going, and we got going right at the very first one, with the Guardsmen. And then they came along right after that. But we never dreamt we would be able to play together, ever. We simply had the first one who offered us a play or plays was Lee Schubert, of all people.
I think that an actor would be very useful to have enough to pay his rent and feed himself. Yeah. He needn't have enough to buy his clothes, because that's gravy, isn't it? Mm-hmm. But if he had a roof over his head and enough to eat, then he could wait out the long waits between jobs.
Did I ever say to you that I think one of the secrets of our being happy right along while we were married was because we would go down to the theatre and act two other lovers every night?
That's interesting. Why?
Well, we became two other people that night, you see. So we had a little variety.
Oh, I loved him. Utterly. We were very close together. We did the same job, you see, and we were like twins, you know.
And he said you were the most fascinating person in the world.
He said, did he? Oh. Well, there.
I was born in Tennessee in 1818. When I was in my 40s, I moved to Milwaukee and ran a small grocery store. After that, I worked for millionaire banker Alexander Mitchell. In 1865, when local election officials denied me the right to vote simply because I was black, I sued them and I won. When the Wisconsin Supreme Court decided unanimously in favor of suffrage rights for blacks.
I was born in 1836 in Germany. When I was 12 years old, I came to this country with my family, and we settled in Chicago. That was in 1848, just 4 years after Jacob Best and his 4 sons had started their brewery here in Milwaukee. I became a steamship captain on the Great Lakes, and Philip Best was one of my customers. Met him in 1860. Would travel on my ship on business for his brewery, and occasionally his beautiful daughter Maria would accompany him. I started courting Maria, and we were married at the Best home in 1862 and went to live with the Best family. Eventually I sold my steamship and went into business with my father-in-law. And after his death, I became president of the Philip Best Brewing Company. By 1888, we had become the largest lager brewery in the world. And we changed the name to the Pabst Brewing Company that year. 2 years later, we started drawing up plans for this fine new house up on Grand Avenue and moved in 1892. I was 56 then, Maria was 51, and we spent the rest of our years here. Maria had given me 11 beautiful children, but we lost 6 of them to childhood diseases. Our first grandchild, Frederick, lived only 4 months, and not long after that, his mother, our beloved Elizabeth, died at the age of 26. In 1900, we lost our son-in-law, Rudolf Nunemacher. I died in 1904, on New Year's Day, here in this house. My funeral was held in this room. Less than 3 years later, Maria followed me in death. And now, today, we all lie peacefully together out at Forest Home Cemetery. Despite all the tragedy, all the sadness in our lives, we had a good life. Our 5 surviving children gave us great comfort and happiness. Our grandchildren were a delight to us. We had a good life here in Milwaukee, a very good life.
I had a little laboratory in the basement of my mother's house on Prospect Avenue. My father had died when I was quite young. In the basement, my brother Harry and I would often conduct electrical experiments, and after lots of work, I actually developed a mechanism to control the electric motor. One of my first big customers was a Dr. Stanton Allen, who provided financial backing that I desperately needed for the construction and testing of my products. That's why we eventually would name our company Allen Bradley. We built that company into one of the world's largest manufacturers of electrical controls. When I died in 1942, my brother Harry succeeded me as company president.
I believe that if you want to study architecture, you should go to a cemetery because it's got every conceivable type of architecture that in the last 150 years in America. Cemeteries are actually a relatively recent phenomenon. It started after the Reformation around there, but I think that we mark our graves because we want to be remembered and we want to remember people. It's one thing to maybe to write somebody's name down in a book or something like that, but to actually put it on stone or in bronze just has a huge impact of remembrance. Cemeteries were our first public open spaces. We didn't have formal parks when cities were built 150 years ago. And cemeteries became the places to gather, not just for memorialization, but for an outing. And so it just became a popular place to go, and then, of course, a popular place to be buried. Back around maybe about 100 years ago or 150 years ago, we entered kind of the golden age of memorialization. It kind of came about because it was in the Victorian times, and Queen Victoria, when Prince Albert died, she went on kind of a memorialization frenzy, and she just started doing all these things for Albert. And as Queen Victoria went, so went society in Victorian times, and so memorialization became kind of in fashion, and lots and lots of if you had lots of money, you'd had elaborate memorials, and depending on how much money you had determined the size of memorial, but almost everybody had memorials. Also, families were much more closer and intact. They weren't so dissipated as they are nowadays. So families tended to have family plots, and they would come to cemeteries and to tend those plots. Cemeteries are a celebration of life. They're not, they don't make me sad at all. It's just wonderful stuff, and it's what makes me very happy is to see this wonderful art that's preserved in cemeteries. So it's very joyful to me, cemeteries.
We're now at the monument of General Erastus B. Wolcott, who was Wisconsin's Surgeon General in the Civil War. His second wife, Laura, was the first woman physician here in Milwaukee. Increase Lapham, Wisconsin's Renaissance man. Small monument for a large contribution to Wisconsin history. Died here in 1875. He came as a surveyor with Byron Kilburn and to survey this land, and he made the first geological survey of Wisconsin. He wrote a treatise on Indian effigy mounds. He did handbooks on Wisconsin native vegetation and marine life. And he donated land for the first high school here in Milwaukee. And he set up a weather station on top of the Mitchell building. And that was for the U.S. Signal Service. And since that was folded into the U.S. Weather Bureau, we call him father of the U.S. Weather Bureau.
Ilsley was from Maine, and I was originally from Pennsylvania, but somehow we both ended up in Milwaukee, where our paths crossed and we became good friends. Ilsley and I became business partners in 1849, and we ran what would eventually become the state's oldest private bank. We finally incorporated Marshall and Ilsley in 1888.
If you have just a minute, I would like to tell you a little bit about myself and my military career. I think it's time that I set the record straight about why I was court-martialed. And I think it's time that I separate the fact from the fiction. I grew up in Milwaukee, the son of a United States Senator. My grandfather, Alexander Mitchell, was a millionaire banker and a railroad tycoon. I began my military career when I was just 18 years old. And 5 years later, I was the youngest captain in the Army. You know, I didn't even learn how to fly a plane until I was in my 30s, but I eventually became the head of the aviation section of the United States Army. Now remember, there was no separate Air Force at that time. By the time World War I was drawing to an end, I was convinced beyond any doubt that air power would be the key force in any future military struggle. I spoke out loudly and very clearly about the potential of air power, about the need for a separate branch of the armed forces devoted exclusively to planes and the men who fly them. Unfortunately, many of those in charge of the Army and the Navy looked on those of us who flew as nothing more than bastard children who were taking resources and attention away from the troops and the ships. After some tragic Navy air disasters in 1925, I told the press that those accidents were the direct result of incompetence, criminal negligence, and the almost treasonable administration of the national defense by both the War and the Navy departments. And I meant that with every bone in my body. My comments outraged some of my superiors, including the President of the United States. I was charged with insubordination, and Coolidge ordered that I be court-martialed. The verdict was guilty. Guilty on all charges. I was expected then to be grateful for the president ordering only a 5-year suspension at half pay. I told them all to forget it. I resigned. In my remaining years, I continued to speak out, campaigning for increased attention to air power. I wanted everyone to know, everyone who would listen, that the United States of America, if it had the will, could become the leading air power in the world. I died in New York in 1936. Just 56 years old. My body was brought back to the family plot at Forest Home Cemetery. Time, of course, proved that I was right all along. World War II would make that abundantly clear. It wasn't until a dozen years after my death that I was awarded a special congressional medal in honor of my service and my foresight.
Forest Home Cemetery is a public trust. St. Paul's Episcopal Church overviews the operation of Forest Home Cemetery, and it's available for all faiths. Forest Home Cemetery has 200 acres. In that 200 acres, approximately 20 to 25 acres is yet undeveloped. We have a great deal of property available, from family mausoleum spaces to private family mausoleum spaces to community mausoleum spaces to flush marker spaces, raised marker spaces, monument lots, and so forth. We're able to keep Forest Home Cemetery in the condition that it is in presently and the way it was in the past with a large perpetual care fund. Our perpetual care fund is in excess of $12 million. The perpetual care fund is a group of monies that were set aside from each particular sale of property and put into a deposit, and only the interest is used to maintain the cemetery from that perpetual care fund. The initial deposits are not touched, so that particular fund is up to $12 million at this time.
We're at the Charles Best Monument, and he died here in Milwaukee in 1877. He came from Mettenheim on the Rhine, and where they grew wine. But when he came here, he made vinegar, and he was quite successful. And he went back and he got his family and brought his father over, his father Jacob, his brother Philip, and more of the family. Now Philip's daughter Marie married Captain Pabst, and Best Beer became Pabst Beer. And so the slogan was, "He who drinks best drinks Pabst." But Charles came here and, as I said, made a start with a vinegar works, and he was a real go-getter. And so eventually he and his brother Lawrence started a brewery, another brewery here in Milwaukee, and it was called the Plank Road Brewery. And 4 or 5 years after they started it, Lawrence died, and I think Charles lost interest, and he sold the brewery to Fred Miller. That's now the Miller Brewery of international fame.
In 1855, I came to Milwaukee from Germany and worked at the August Krug Brewery. When Krug died, I took over management of the place, and a few years later I married his widow. In 1874, we changed the name to the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company. The next year, while going back to Germany for a visit, there was a shipwreck and I was lost at sea.
I was born and educated in Maine and clerked at a large dry goods store in Boston. In 1857, I moved to Milwaukee to open my own store here. In my first year in business, gross sales totaled an impressive $35,000. Business grew and grew until a disastrous fire in 1884 destroyed my store and $750,000 worth of inventory. But I rebuilt right on the same corner. Each year I would spend at least a few weeks back at the farm of my birth in my beloved Maine. I died in 1892.
We're at Matthias Stein's monument. Interesting man. First gunsmith in Milwaukee. He came from Germany, and he lived up above where the city hall is now. There's a slight hill to the east, and his house was up there. And at that time, the area where City Hall was a swamp. And so he could sit on his front porch and use one of the guns that he made and shoot ducks for dinner.
Superintendent of Grounds Jerry Gaudinsky has been working here for more than 40 years, ever since he was 16 years old. Digging graves, cutting grass, trimming trees, making sure that this outdoor museum looks picture perfect.
I love the challenge of something being different, the unknown, working outdoors, the elements, other than rain when it slows down the production, and snow when it becomes a task to remove snow to find or locate a certain grave for excavation. We have a crew come out with tobacco and a truck, and we haul away a certain amount of ground for displacement of the liner or grave box or steel vault in some cases. and we'll take away a certain amount of displacement, and after that we will put the remainder of the ground on top of plywood depending upon the season, which is, as in this case, spring, and the ground becomes soft. The family will pick out a vault from various vault companies depending upon their choice, and the purpose of the liner is so that the ground does not sink or collapse for the safety of the public and or employees and other equipment going over the site. When we start an excavation, we dig approximately 5 to 5.5 feet deep, which is a good depth. We'll have approximately 3.5 feet of soil on top of the vault. We usually do that a day ahead of time, maybe 2 days ahead of time to keep on schedule. And comes the day of the service, I'll have a certain crew go out and set up the greens, and they'll know what the time is, and we'll have a sales counselor that leads out all the funerals, and everybody is equipped with a two-way radio, and upon completion of the service, the sales counselor will radio the individuals that I have designated to service the funeral. For a grass level marker, it is excavated and there is sand put underneath it to level it. And if we have an upright marker, which is 10, 12 inches depending upon the size, we'll dig a foundation to a depth of at least 3.5 feet and pour concrete, and the monument dealer will bring the marker and we will set the marker level, plumb, and in line with existing markers on that particular lot. Right now we approximately have 8 people during the winter time, and our work staff will increase up to about approximately 25 people starting towards the latter part of April and May, and we will carry that over all the way through approximately the first week in December, and their main job will be cutting grass all day long. And we have a string trimming crew which consists of 12 string trimmers, and they'll start at point A, make a complete cycle, start back over at point A again after the cycle is completed, and that holds true the same as for the mowing crew. They'll start at point A, make a complete cycle, and start all over again, and it's just one cycle that takes continuously all summer long. Depending upon the amount of rain we get, there may be a slow time when the grass kind of goes dormant. I find it very gratifying that we can maintain the grounds or attempt to maintain the grounds like a golf course, so when people come here or visitors, family, they are proud to be at Forest Home Cemetery.
It was while working as a janitor at the state capitol that I decided for sure that I wanted to be a lawyer. I entered law school, and in 1892, I graduated with honors. I defended nearly all the black defendants in Milwaukee at the turn of the century, and I worked tirelessly to secure passage of the Wisconsin Civil Rights Act of 1895. I died in 1911.
I was an inventor and a tinkerer. I also happened to be a Milwaukee newspaper man. In 1867, I invented what I guess you'd call a crude writing machine, which I patented. It became what everyone else called the typewriter.
This is the Brumder plot. My family, I'm E.J. Brumder, and my grandfather George came from Alsace-Lorraine. That's in France, right near the Rhine River. Sometimes it was German, sometimes it was French, back and forth. And he was 18, he came here, he brought his sister to be married to a Lutheran minister. And he ended up in 1910 when he died. He was the largest publisher of German language newspapers in the United States. I've become so interested in this. You see how people have worked hard, saved their money, and then been lucky. Had a job or a business that suddenly became important, and because of the immigrants that came into Milwaukee, this happened to many families, and that certainly is the story of the last century, that the most important ingredient was the immigrants coming from Europe and other places. And they're all buried here. and they started families, they had businesses. Some of them became very successful. And it's interesting to me just to know, how it all happened, how Milwaukee happened.
Here at Forest Home Cemetery, we have roughly 10,000 square feet under glass. We grow mostly from seed, and most of the flowers are going to be going out on the grounds. A lot of them will be for graves themselves, and quite a few go into our formal gardens. Here you can see an example of where nature meets granite. This stone was obviously put here, and the tree was planted too close, so they grew together. We have to be very careful in our planting trees at Forest Home Cemetery so that they don't infringe on future grave spaces and they don't get in the way of future interments and burials. Here on the sides of the halls of history, you can see a beautiful rhododendron. This one's probably in the neighborhood of 20 years old. It's doing as well as it is because it was planted in the right place in a shady area, and it needs that kind of protected environment to do well. It'll flower for approximately 2 weeks, and it does have a very, very nice flower show, as you can see. And we try to maintain flowering plants throughout the cemetery to enhance people's visits here, to make them glad that they came, and basically to enhance their visit of visiting a loved one. What we have here now is an ironwood tree. I like to call this a character tree because of the unique pattern of the bark. You won't find anything quite like this, I don't believe, anywhere else. This isn't a normal pattern of bark for an ironwood, but you can see the bumps on it. Most of them are more striated, more straight lines, but this one's just unique. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a perfectly healthy tree, and I just think it's really unusual and quite a nice specimen, so I like to point this out to various groups and people that might come here. This is a ginkgo tree, which is very hardy here, and we've got quite a few on the property. And then another one of my favorite trees is this sycamore, which is more of a southern climed species. Fairly unusual for here. You'll see a few scattered along the lakefront, but basically not very hardy here. This one struggles every year, gets a bit of anthracnose, but it seems to pull through. Forest Home is more than just a cemetery to me. It's really an arboretum. I'm quite fascinated with the various variety of trees that were planted in the past, and there's literally hundreds of varieties planted throughout the 200 acres we have here. We've added quite a bit to that. We've planted at least 200 trees since I've been here, and we're concentrating on diversity and really making it an arboretum. We've got quite a few unusual specimen plants, and we're hoping to ensure that we have them in the future, which is the reason for our planting program. Forest Home has a very rich horticultural history. The formal gardens, the tree plantings, the hedges, everything here is pretty much speaks of a stately situation that we portray it to be and want it to be.
Glenn, there's so much life in this place that some people would say has a reputation for death. Do you find a cemetery a depressing place?
I personally don't. I think it's a place to reflect and be with nature, and I think the more beautiful it is, the more you realize what a beautiful planet we live on, and just the richness of life. And we strive to make it a beautiful place with the plantings and just with the maintenance of it, so that when people come here, we hope that they have fond memories of their loved ones and basically of their visit here. We want to make sure that they come back and look at it more than just a cemetery and look at it more as a place of beauty.
I think it's very important to remember the histories of prominent people in our community, but we have to remember that prominent people are not the only ones who have had interesting lives, important lives, interesting thoughts. Prominent people are not the only people who have shaped the world that we live in today. Ordinary people have had jobs, raised families, gone off to fight in wars. They belong to community organizations. They've been forces for change. And historians are, of course, very interested in the sources of change throughout history. And we want to know how all kinds of people help to shape change over the years. Ordinary people have contributed in many ways to the world that we live in, and we really need to know about that. But it's also very important to look at the gravestones of ordinary people and to think about why you might find a young girl dying at the age of 13 or 10 or 9. What was it about the health of ordinary people, or the health care, or the lack of health care, that might have caused so many children to die at such a young age? Or for that matter, what about the deaths of women in their 20s and 30s? What caused it? Was it a disease of some kind, or did it have to do with occupational health and safety issues? And the same with men. Were men having heart attacks in their early 40s back in the 1920s or 1910s? We don't really know, but I think it's valuable to ask those kinds of questions and also to think about the kinds of families that these people lived in. I always encourage students when they're walking through cemeteries, if they get interested in a gravesite, to do some research. And suppose you see a family that's buried there together, it's possible to go back and to take that name and go back and see if there's an obituary on the people who are buried there and find out something about their lives. What kind of work did they do? How many people were in their families? How long did the family stay together? Why did the people die? And what can we learn about the history of ordinary people just from doing some simple research based upon what we may find in cemeteries?
You know, I don't think that it forces us to face our own mortality as much as it probably reminds each person the value of life. It reminds each person that we are alive, and therefore there's something that we should be doing. That's what I think. I think some of the emotions are certainly sadness, because we realize that for every person who is there, no doubt they are connected to a whole variety of people. So every time you see a grave, you know that somebody has lost their friends who don't have a significant friend, a significant other, an employee, a parent, a sibling, a child. Everyone is connected to someone else. And so when you walk through a cemetery, I think we're reminded of our connectedness to other people. I think we're reminded first of the energy of life, that we are alive, and therefore we can do something.
I think, as we sometimes say, one of the main reasons to study history is to understand what it has meant to be human. And knowing what it's meant to be human and all of the dimensions of that maybe help us to know how to go about the world in a better way.